Hello and welcome to the Oncology Journal Club podcast, where oncology papers meet real-world practice. I'm your producer, Rachel Babin, and joining me again are Professor Craig Underhill, Dr. Kate Clarke, and Professor Christopher Jackson. Together, they dive into the research shaping cancer care, the important, the intriguing, and the sometimes controversial. This podcast is proudly produced by the Oncology Network. Head over to oncologynetwork.com.au for the show notes with links to all of the papers discussed today. Okay, over to you, Craig.
G'day. How exciting. It's ASCO time, and this is the first of two planned ASCO updates. And it's a pleasure to have here Dr. Kate Clarke,
Okay.
Kiora, and Professor Chris Jackson, who both went to ASCO this year. How was the vibe?
We're both like, what can we say?
Were you just telling me that people were apologising for Trump?
Yeah. I think people are appalled at the concept of an MMA fight celebrating the 250 years of one of our greatest democracies. But as always, Chicago is beautiful. The people are so incredibly polite. Entry and exit to the States is intimidating, particularly when you don't have to hand your passport over anymore because your photo recognizes you. That kind of grossed me out. But no, and still, ASCO is an amazing meeting. The corridors are less full.
Yeah.
Definitely the planes are less full. And quite a few of the presenters had to be online as they couldn't get into the country, which is sad.
Whoa, so tell me about that. You mean they're from countries where there's travel bans and so they're allowed to give online talks, or?
So I don't think it's as quite as straight cut as countries' travel bans. No, so the two that I'm thinking of, one was from Kenya and a couple were from China. And I think some of it is just the sheer weight of numbers and not being able to turn that around very fast in a public service that over the last few years has not necessarily got a salary all the time. So I think some of it is just inefficiencies in a stressed system rather than political disasters. Yeah.
But also, I think there were certainly the fewest Kiwis who've ever been to an ASCO in my memory anyway. There was maybe only about 10 or 12 possibly at the outside attending ASCO. There's normally 30 or 40 really. So it was a really, really low number from New Zealand too. People are choosing to watch it online or just not going.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? Because there was a big bounce back after COVID, big numbers. But it's dropped off again, do you think?
It feels like it's dropped off a wee bit, Craig. You know, I guess we'll see the final numbers there. Also, the pharmaceutical industry is shrinking, so there's no pharmaceutical reps from New Zealand there at all. I don't bump into too many Aussies either, so it'd be interesting to know how many Aussies were actually there.
Yeah. I didn't get the feeling that there was as many colleagues going this year as other years, and maybe that's the cost as well now with the war in Iran. The airfares have spiked, whether that is an issue. Anyway, interesting. So, Christopher, what did you think was your highlight?
Look, the highlight for me was I actually got to give a talk this year. I've never done a talk at ASCO before, so that was actually the highlight for me. You've got a trumpet that you can blow for me, Craig? That was in the an ASCO educational session for our Common Sense Oncology group. Look, there were a couple of highlights for me. First of all, one of the highlights was the president of ASCO, Eric Small, just gave one of the best presidential oratories I think I've ever heard. It was humane, it was compassionate, it was focused on community, and the theme was around access. Eric told a bit of a personal story. He lost his wife, who was a medical oncologist, to cancer about 6 months ago, and he shared that with the entire audience at ASCO, and he was just reflecting on the fact that she was a medical oncologist too. And despite all of their combined knowledge, connections, literacy, and financial means, just how hard they found navigating that pathway because she had clear cell ovarian, a rare variant of ovarian cancer, and what they learnt about that from navigating the system and reflected on if it was hard for them, how much harder was it for the average person. So he just exuded compassion, concern and care. But such personal trauma only 6 months ago to be able to share that vulnerably with that massive audience was huge. So that was a massive highlight for me. And in his presidential session, he gave a shout out to my educational sessions. So that was a highlight. And then, of course, the evidence, and there's only really one trial on anyone's lips at the moment, and that's the Resolute 302 that we'll talk about.
Yep, great. There was another issue that you were telling me about before we started recording.
Oh, yeah, look, I think one of the highlights of ASCO is the connections that you have at ASCO every year, the people you catch up with and the quality of the relationships you have. And our co-host was really struck by jet lag and terrible insomnia. And so Kate went for a wander late one night, and I was also out for a wander after having drunk too many cups of coffee. I bumped into her accidentally. And we we said, well, look, it's the only place in the street we can find which is open. Maybe we should just pop in here for a cup of tea or something. So we went in, we had a cup of tea. There were some locals there. We started chatting to the locals, and then the locals sort of thrust a microphone in their mouth. And Kate, as a erstwhile potty, knew what to do with the microphone. She started talking like she was doing a podcast, but in actual fact, she ended up just singing a song. It was... But she just played along with the Americans. She's such a good sport, you know. We didn't run and do it the right
karaoke bar. That's what you're telling us.
Oh no, it's called a speakeasy, and it was because Kate's a podcaster. You know, they knew that she was from the world's 13th most popular oncology podcast, and they basically celebrity fangirled her. It was excellent. She's lucky to get out of there in one piece.
Particularly as the very next artist made us do a dance where we all ended up in a crouch, and I needed assistance to get back up again.
I thought it was a CrossFit workout.
It was a Sunday night karaoke bar, which I just think we need more of those. Chris is right. The highlight for me, I think, has to be all of these new mechanisms that have taken my career to figure out, and we're now seeing that coming to fruition. So the very clever science, the RAS, both on RAS and downstream RAS stuff, which we'll talk about in the next podcast, the bispecifics, we're at a point now where we're thinking logically about cancer, and then figuring out what to do about it, rather than just throwing some poisons at it in a different mix each time and hope we hit a bonus. Chris and I have seen that over the 20 years of our career. It's kind of awesome.
Yeah, I really agree with that, Kate. I mean, I think we started in the chemotherapy era, and then we had the monoclonal antibody era, then the precision medicine era with targeted therapies. And then we hit the IO era, and I think we're at the other end of the IO era now with pembrolizumab and nivolumab both going off patent next year. You know, we've had the other PD-1, the Me-Toos have come along the last couple of years, but largely it's bispecifics and the T-cell engagers and the antibody-drug conjugates now. So it's certainly a different therapeutic era for those agents now. That's what we're seeing. So it's cool to catch up with that.
Yeah, it's exciting, isn't it? I've seen it all, because when I started, there was like about 2 chemotherapy drugs. So, you know, it is really a very different era. So let's...
So you trained with Vincent DeVita, didn't you?
No, Danny DeVita, but I don't know a Vincent DeVita. So let's get into it. So I think you're just going to go through the plenary papers to start off with and see how far we get. So let's do late breaking abstract 1, the PROTEUS study. This was perioperative neoadjuvant and adjuvant apalutamide and androgen deprivation therapy versus placebo with radical prostatectomy in high-risk localized or locally advanced prostate cancer. So this was the final analysis of the PROTEUS phase 3 study. So this got a lot of the urologists very excited. I saw a headline saying that there was 10 times as many complete responses, pathological complete responses, which is one of the main endpoints in the trial, which was probably a little bit of a hype because it was really 1% versus 9%. So I guess it is 10 times, but it's a pretty low pathological response rate. And it did demonstrate an improvement in time to first subsequent therapy and event-free survival. So this trial was for men with high risk, locally advanced, localized prostate cancer. And that includes on clinical staging, disease extending just outside of the prostate. The traditional treatment has been either radiotherapy, which is usually combined with peri-radiotherapy, neoadjuvant and adjuvant hormones for a specified period of time, often 12 months, or radical prostatectomy. So that's been the standard of care until this trial came along. And in this trial, they gave men either ADT and placebo or ADT plus apalutamide. So there was no control arm, which was the standard of care at the time the trial was written, which was just the radical prostatectomy. So they did make a change. There was a cohort of men who did receive radiotherapy alone, and that will be the subject of further analysis. And in addition, during the time of the study, because PSMA PETs were becoming standard of care for staging, they actually modified the protocol and included that. So for the first part of the study, men were just staged with conventional treatment, and they could have a PSA of up to 20, which is quite high. In our modern management, certainly in Australia, most men who've had PSA of 20, most centres I think would give them a PSMA PET to really look at whether they have some occult metastatic disease not seen on conventional imaging. So it's interesting that changed, and I didn't see in the analysis a breakdown of the patients who were in the first cohort or in the second cohort that had PSMA PET. But nevertheless, they did demonstrate that the men who received apalutamide and ADT, both before and after the radical prostatectomy, did have an advantage in terms of pathological CR rate, metastasis-free survival, event-free survival, and time to first subsequent therapy. And the difference there was actually 41 months versus 74 months. So quite a big difference. So I noted that Declan Murphy, a well-known urological surgeon at Peter Mac and in private in Melbourne, was the discussant, and he believed that this was a new standard therapy option for men with high-risk prostate cancer. I think that's probably a true statement. It is an option, but I'm really looking forward to seeing the further analysis of that cohort that received just the surgery to really see whether adding in these hormones and androgen receptor inhibitors can really make a difference in these men.
So, Craig, talk me through the endpoint, the primary endpoint, the PSMA-based metastasis-free survival.
Yeah, well, it might not even been PSMA PET-free survival, PET-guided event-free survival in the first part of the study because the PSMA PETs weren't mandatory. But the main endpoints were this pathological complete response rate.
And is that validated for any clinically meaningful endpoints at all? Is that validated?
Not particularly, not as in some cancers. It's used as a surrogate, but it's not really, I don't think there's necessarily a correlation with survival or benefit to patients. And the rate was really low. As I said, it was 1% versus 9%. So that was trumpeted as wow, it's 10 times as high. But, compared to other cancers, that's a very low pathological CR rate. So you'd expect, therefore, that if there were micrometastases, in 10% of people, they responded well. But if there is micrometastases, then it's not going to be curative.
And the metastasis-free survival, the 5-year metastasis-free survival difference was what, 5%? Is that right?
Was 20% reduction in the risk of metastasis occurring. And if you look at the curves compared to some of the curves we saw in some of the other plenary presentations, you can't drive a bus between those curves. It's quite minimal. The event-free survival curves look more impressive, and the time to first subsequent therapy looked the most impressive of all, with a clear difference in a benefit. And so it was nearly a 3-year difference in the treatment-free interval to the men receiving the combination. So that's a big gain, but it's also 3 years of the side effects of the ADT and the apalutamide.
Yeah, look, I really worry about that, because in a clinical trial where you're looking at an event-free survival on a radiologic endpoint, you're scanning people a whole lot more commonly than you would do in routine clinical practice. So the idea of initiation of your next treatment is somehow skewed by your intensity of your scanning frequency. So I don't know that it would necessarily be what would happen in the clinic. I do worry about the endpoints in this trial, Craig.
Yeah, good. And same thoughts I think that other people had, Chris. And one of the key pieces of data to come is the quality of life data.
Yeah.
So that wasn't presented. And so if you're going to be on treatment for an extra 3 years, that's likely to have significant impact on quality of life. So we'll wait and see for the more detail in the subsequent presentations.
And I'm not a GU oncologist these days. Just can you give us a quick idea of what the toxicities of apalutamide might be for those who don't use the drug?
There wasn't a huge extra difference. The main one's actually a rash. So the grade 2-3 rash was 5% versus less than 1% in the other patient, in placebo patients. Everyone got ADT, so there's all the side effects of ADT, loss of libido, sexual dysfunction, etc., fatigue, weight gain. But the extra difference in the apalutamide was mostly around the most significant was rash.
The discussant made a point to say there's been no demonstrated survival advantage to androgen deprivation in this setting. And so there should have been an arm without the ADT, particularly as that's where most of your tox is coming from. So yes, it's a cheap intervention, but it's a very expensive to the person intervention. And that I understand there's no survival advantage to that in this setting. So they're curious as to why they had to go in because that's how the apalutamide works, but it was odd.
So they mentioned that there was a cohort that didn't get the ADT, that only had surgery, that they're going to use as a comparator. So I don't know if that's a sort of matched cohort or whether that was actually part of the subsequent randomization. It was a little bit unclear to me. But you're absolutely right, Kate, because we need that survival data to really demonstrate and allow people to make the choice with the known extra side effects, a likely reduction in quality of life. What's the survival benefit, if any, that would allow you to choose that therapy? The paper was also concurrently published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Is that on our bingo card? That should be. And so we'll put a link to that as well. All right. Whose turn to present?
So LBA2 is sarcoma made the plenary. So that's pretty exciting. Just a bit of background for those of us, including myself, who do not treat sarcoma. So this trial was looking at a very small subset of liposarcoma, because liposarcomas go on a huge spectrum from sit around and don't do very much to grow like wildfire. The ones that grow like wildfire are called de-differentiated liposarcoma, and a patient may have many different, very much like neuroendocrine tumor, a patient may have diverse disease within the one disease state. So they may have some poorly differentiated, some well differentiated, etc. So in order to get onto this trial, you had to have demonstrated both pathologically and by progression within the last 6 months that you have a population of de-differentiated liposarcoma. It took a significant length of time to gather the 108 patients, there you go, that they have. So I think this is incredibly well done for a rare disease to get the number of patients. They're exploiting the fact that cyclin-dependent kinase 4, CDK4, is ubiquitously amplified in this disease. And of course, those of us treating breast cancer, we're now very familiar with CDK4 and 6 inhibitors. And abemaciclib has more CDK4 inhibition than the others that are commercially available. So that's why they chose abemaciclib. Given at slightly higher doses than they give within breast cancer, but remember, these patients aren't also on hormonal therapy. Demonstrated statistically significant improvement in progression-free survival of 9.7 months versus placebo of 1.5 months, which is the first scan. Median overall survival not reached in the treatment arm as yet, but just over 2 years in the placebo arm. Crossover was mandated. Really interesting. Overall response rate after crossover was lower, as was median progression-free survival after crossover, probably because you're losing some patients as they develop more and more disease. But it's only a 6-week difference, or 6 weeks, maybe a month of organising. So you've lost your patient in that 3 months, which I think is fascinating. So statistically significant improvement in PFS, encouraging OS trend, which I think we'll read out as positive. Well-designed trial in a rare disease, was well discussed by perhaps a less enthusiastic discussant than the person that presented it, but worth listening to if you treat sarcoma. But sadly, I cannot see, I think this is the one abstract that doesn't appear to have a simultaneous publication. So if anybody can find that for me and prove me wrong, I'll be happy to hear from you. But I think all of the others gained simultaneous publications.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I did a bit of digging around and I was interested to know a bit more about this type of sarcoma, and actually found an NCCN publication from a couple of years ago, which was about updates in sarcoma, and they actually mentioned the phase 2 studies that had happened with the CDK4/6 inhibitors with this de-differentiated liposarcoma. So this was probably not a surprise. It was something that was kind of expected might be advanced. And it just, to me, it sort of highlights that this precision medicine, testing all tumours with next generation sequencing if it's available, looking for potential targets, and then rational design of studies to prove that various molecules may or may not work in a particular cancer. I think it's another reason why the field's moving in the way it is towards more precision medicine.
Just a quick point on the common sense oncology principles here. This is a trial whereby crossover was permitted after progression, and that did look to maintain the OS signal, even though the crossover was permitted, which suggests that the sequencing is quite critical there, so getting it first seems to be important. And those who've got their OJC bingo cards out at the moment, it was a trend towards significance, but was not statistically significant, but was probably clinically meaningful. So there we go, another point for your bingo card.
Fantastic.
Before we get back to the papers, if there's a study you think we should be covering on the Oncology Journal Club podcast, feel free to send it our way. You can join the Oncology Network. Remember, registration is free. And leave us a voice note on the OJC page. That's at oncologynetwork.com.au. Or come and chat with us on our socials. And physicians, please don't forget that you can claim CME points for listening to the show. All right, back to the Journal Club.
Kate, I think you're going to do number 3. We fought over who would do this one.
Yeah. So Craig is not only involved in the setup thereof of this trial within his community, but he is a lung treater, and I am not, but I grabbed this one. So this is LBA3, selpercatinib in early stage RET fusion positive non-small cell lung cancer and adjuvant TKIs in lung cancer. We're now up to quite a few. So we have osimertinib in the EGFR mutant space, 5-year OS of 85 versus 73%. We have alectinib in the ALK positive space, 4-year OS of 98 versus 92%. So there's definitely a signal here. And particularly for both osimertinib and alectinib, decrease in CNS events, which of course is symptomatically very meaningful for patients. So this setting, phase 3, look, I don't know why, and I'm not clever enough to understand why, so I apologize in advance, but stage 2 or stage 1B, 2 or 3A patients were included, but the primary endpoint is event-free survival in stage 2 or 3A disease. There's not very many 1B patients included, and they did do a secondary endpoint that tacked the stage 1B onto the bigger group. They didn't independently publish that what happened to the 1B group. So it kind of feels like trying to get your outcome, but maybe you'll be able to sell a bit more drug if the 1B doesn't dilute the effect of everybody else. But anyway, that's just me being a cynic. So the event-free survival at 2 years is 94% with selpercatinib and 70% with placebo, with a hazard ratio of 0.17. Just remembering that the median progression-free survival in metastatic RET fusion selpercatinib is about 26 months. So it's a little bit early to see whether we're just treating subclinical disease, but obviously we've seen this in OC and alectinib that eventually an OS was read out. So Libretto 432, screamingly positive for an event-free survival. In terms of toxicity, what you'd expect, transient transaminases, all of the deaths on trial were in the placebo group, all due to disease, which is not unexpected.
Yeah, so hopefully that if you look at the curves, there's a big separation. So hopefully, like we saw, as you said, in the EGFR positive and ALK positive patient subgroups, that we'll see that translate into big benefits in overall survival. It's early days yet. RET fusion positive patients is like a 1% lung cancer, I think. But with lung cancer being a relatively common cancer, there's probably more RET fusion positive patients in some other rare cancers. It's kudos to Eli Lilly, who persevered to get this study up and running. And it's similar to the SARC 041 trial that you just talked about, Kate. These are hard to do trials in rare cancers. So Eli Lilly came to Australia looking for centres for that study, and not one single centre in Australia was willing to take that on because they wanted 2 patients in the 2 years, and people did the maths and they didn't think they would have enough patients. So they approached our little old regional trials network of 7 sites and said, what do you guys think with in your catchment, you've got close to a couple of million people and 10,000 new patients a year. We've worked out that you'll have more than 2 RET fusion positive lung cancer patients. Would you like to run it as a decentralized clinical trial across your network? And a few of our sites took that on. We had used a rapid startup process. So the sites weren't part of the governance and ethics process, and then only did site training if they identified a patient. And the network put 3 patients on within the 2 years. It was a global effort to get, I can't remember how many patients were on the trial, Kate, a couple of hundred?
151.
Yeah, there you go. And, there was multiple sites across the globe needed to do that.
Practically, Craig, so while this trial was running, or routinely you were doing RET fusions on all of your resective cancers, or?
Yeah, so thanks to the work of Toga.
Yep.
So they were trumpeting every patient should have the next-gen sequencing up front, and they've got another trial doing that. So basically doing the people have enough tissue, and if they don't have enough tissue, thinking about liquid biopsies to do the next generation sequencing, look for actionable mutations, and then being able to plug them into clinical trials. So it just highlights again, operationally, we need to put the systems in place that as many people as possible can get access to that testing, either NGSs or a panel up front, and then put onto clinical trials. The good thing is this is adjuvant. So this was people who'd had surgery. That's why it's the 1B to 3AK. The 3Bs and 4s are, 3Bs will generally have chemoradiotherapy and the 4s are metastatic. So it meant that they had tissue at the time of surgery. There was enough tissue to test, and there was time to process that and then put them on an adjuvant study post-op.
It's the 1Bs I'm offended by, not the 2s and 3s. The 1Bs are included in the inclusion, but not analysed at the end. But that's going to come up again shortly.
Yeah, I think, again, Craig, well done to your decentralised trial network for participating in that to make it happen. I completely agree with your analysis that it's hard to do those trials like that of very rare mutations, but great to see it actually achieved. So next time someone says it's a rare tumour, can't be done, I'll say Craig Underhill says it can.
That's right. We need to get to national studies in these rare cancers. So someone's a primary site, the satellite sites, and they get opened if they identify a patient. Otherwise, the trials just won't get done.
But again, I think that speaks to layers of things in the way that we conduct trials that need to change. Not every investigator needs to do 12 hours of training. I think we have to be sensible about what we're doing here and how we're doing it. So that's, I'm excited for you, Craig, in terms of the fact you're able to make that happen. It's awesome.
Yeah. Thanks, Kate. And big shout out to the investigators in Bendigo and Ballarat who recruited patients. I think there was a patient referred from Adelaide for the study. I think one of the big Melbourne centres who will remain nameless, who declined the study, referred a patient to one of the regional hospitals to recruit onto the trial. All right, and the next one's lung cancer, so I'll whiz through that. And this is Harmony 6. So this was ivonescimab plus chemotherapy versus tislelizumab plus chemotherapy in previously untreated advanced squamous non-small cell lung cancer. This is the overall survival results of the phase 3 Harmony 6 trial. I think we talked about Harmony 6 early results maybe in the post-ESMO. And so the ivonescimab is a combined PD-1 and VEGF inhibitor. So this study showed after a median follow-up of 21.36 months, to be precise, the median overall survival was 27.89 versus 23.69. So it's an additional 4 months. Across all the key subgroups, there was benefit in favour of the ivonescimab group. And the presenter and the abstract said this showed manageable toxicity because there was actually 63% of patients had a grade 3 toxicity, which essentially means hospitalisation, and there was a 3% mortality rate, which was similar in both arms. So you can imagine with the VEGF inhibitors in lung cancer, been there before. So the main toxicities were related to hemorrhage, hemoptysis, etc., and other vascular events. So it looks like a clear benefit, but we wait to see what the quality of life cost-benefit analysis is, cost of this drug to add an additional 4 months. But in the discussion, they did mention that this is probably the first trial in lung cancer, certainly in squamous cell lung cancer, with a median survival of over 2 years. We're used to seeing median survivals of 12 months, not 2 years in these patients. But both arms did very well with just under 2 years in the arm that received chemo plus the PD-1 inhibitor.
One interesting thing said by many a discussant at this ASCO, which I think we're going to have to get our head around. So the FDA will not approve drugs that haven't got Americans in the trial. That has filtered through to the discussants who will say this trial that is only relevant to Chinese people, for example. The more relevant subgroup who aren't involved in this trial is women, because Chinese women don't smoke. So there's almost no females in this trial at all. A woman and a man are quite a lot more different than a Chinese person and an American person. So I found that fascinating. The other thing I think that if we start thinking about using this combination ourselves is the inclusion criteria is very tight to try and avoid massive hemorrhage. So they're very clear about which patients should be on trial and which ones shouldn't be. And there will be patient leakage because there always is. And I just think that's something we have to think about really, really carefully when putting people onto this type regimen.
So is that actually an FDA regulation? There have to be centres in America recruiting to the trial or is that just an implicit bias in their approval process?
I'm not sure if it's written down in that way. It's definitely a policy that was brought up a couple of times in the meeting. And obviously the universe is changing at the moment in more of that direction.
So we saved the best to last. We've got Professor Jackson put his hand up to tell us about some boring, unimportant, non-historical study in pancreas cancer.
Well, I think if anyone's not heard the results of this study, they've been off the grid, frankly. And I think we're just going to really recap and talk about some of the methodological issues and some of the impact and the like of the study, I reckon. So this is Resolute 302. So regular listeners will know that we talked about the single-arm study recently, which was just looking at single-arm activity in a basket study, and they read out the pancreas.
I think that was in our last episode, wasn't it?
It was indeed, yeah. Regular listeners will
could have listened to that if they wanted to.
And we talked about the mechanism of action, which is really well worth listening to as well. So this was Resolute 302, daraxonrasib in previously treated metastatic pancreatic cancer, not prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer. Resolute 302 was an international open-labelled phase 3 trial comparing oral daraxonrasib against dealer's choice chemotherapy in patients with previously treated metastatic pancreas cancer. Randomization 1-to-1, more than 90% had KRAS G12 mutant disease. The co-primary endpoints were OS and PFS in the KRAS G12 population, with key secondary endpoints being OS, PFS response rate, and patient-reported outcomes in the overall population. Crossover was not permitted. We'll discuss that in the discussion. What do they find? Well, the headline result is extraordinary. Median overall survival doubled. Chemotherapy 6.6 months. Daraxonrasib 13.2 months. Hazard ratio 0.4. It was powered for a hazard ratio of about 0.8. PFS also improved 3.5 months with chemo to 7.3 with daraxonrasib, and response rates improved as well. And in a disease where second-line studies often deliver weeks rather than months of benefit, anyone remember alotinib? A 6.6-month absolute survival gain is genuinely remarkable. What about toxicity? Well, toxicity story is interesting because it's very different from chemo. Daraxonrasib replaces cytopenias and neuropathy with largely dermatological EGFR-based toxicity because this is a RAS inhibitor. So rash was 86% overall, which is quite high, 86% overall rash. Grade 14% was grade 3. Stomatitis 53% overall, 12% grade 3. Diarrhea 58% overall, which is quite a lot. 5% grade 3, so less than capecitabine.
Do you have paronychia like in the EGFR inhibitors, Chris?
Strangely, that's my next point. Paronychia 17%, essentially absent on the chemo arm.
I didn't know you were going to say that.
You must have read my show notes. And dry skin 13 versus 2%. Rash and nail toxicity are highly reminiscent of EGFR inhibition, and anyone who's used cetuximab will know all about that. This is a figure that I mentioned in last week's potty, and this is the fact of fatigue. Now, I will continue to maintain for many years to come that fatigue is one of the most important quality of life issues for people with advanced cancer, and fatigue was 23% with daraxonrasib, playing 44% with chemo, so lower fatigue, and I think that's really meaningful. And grade 3 fatigue was 3.7 versus 5.6. Treatment discontinuation due to toxicity was dramatically lower, 1% with daraxonrasib, 11.2% with chemo, despite the fact they were on daraxonrasib for longer, almost twice as long. One treatment-related grade 5 event, none with chemo. So they're the headline results, more efficacy and swapping up skin toxicity, lower fatigue rates for neuropathy fatigue with chemo. So let's just go through this with a CSO lens. For starters, this is a good risk population. All patients with ECOG Norton 1. Now, people who treat pancreas cancer know that a lot of people with pancreas cancer have ECOG 2. And this was all ECOG Norton 1. Next of all, about a third of the patients in the study had undergone previous pancreatic resection. And again, people who treat pancreas cancer will know that less than 1 in 5 people has a resection for pancreas cancer. So this is a good risk group. So that's more than most metastatic pancreatic cancer studies. In addition, mandatory molecular profile and tissue acquisition probably also ruled out the rapid progressors as well in the second-line study. So again, it was selecting for people who had a better overall prognosis. But that applies equally to both arms, right? It applies equally to both arms. So it's meaning that daraxonrasib is still salvaging those people who have a delay and who progress in that time. None of that invalidates the results, but it does make the translation to everyday practice slightly less straightforward. And I think that the real-world impacts will be less than what we're seeing in the study in the second-line setting. Now, what about the endpoints, Craig? I was giving you a bit of a grilling about the endpoint earlier. This was a co-primary endpoint of overall survival and progression-free survival. I don't get why they made that decision. But why was overall survival not the primary endpoint? I mean, in pancreas cancer, second line, it doesn't take you very long for events to accrue. And if you have a PFS gain with no OS gain in second line, it's meaningless. So the only endpoint that matters in end-stage pancreas cancer is OS. So why they had a co-primary, I don't know. I don't understand that. Anyway, I think that's the biggest methodological criticism. Attrition before treatment, one notable imbalance deserves attention. 3% of patients randomised to daraxonrasib never started treatment. In contrast, 15% of patients assigned to chemo never received a single dose. Now, that matters more for PFS than OS. But with an OS endpoint, those people would have nicked off and got an on-RAS inhibitor somewhere else or another trial somewhere else probably. But when you've got overall survival, that's going to bias it against the survival for daraxonrasib rather than the other way around, because it would matter for informative censoring for progression-free survival again, which is why I think PFS is a dumb endpoint for a study like this.
That's probably not going to explain all the difference, though, was it? Because you could try through those curves.
100%. I mean, these are all very minor methodological points, but they do highlight the bigger picture if it was a tighter result. But again, the early dropout, early discontinuation would inflate your PFS. It wouldn't inflate your OS. So I again think that's why PFS is a daft endpoint in a study like this. So anyway, the fact that OS is so robust makes it less of a concern. Patients did not get crossover. I celebrate that, actually, Craig. I celebrate that because there are studies where the investigational agent is actively worse. And unless you can guarantee that the investigational agent is not actively worse, which you can't in the first randomized comparison of the agent, then crossover should not be permitted. In this setting now, where you've proved overall survival, when they do it in the first line, crossover should be mandatory because at that point in time, you've already proven overall survival. Yeah. So for this one, I think it's absolutely the right call. It's hard to do that, and it breaks investigators' hearts when you talk about there being no crossover because everyone's excited about the mechanism. But it's scientifically, it's the most rigorous thing to do, and well done to the investigators for doing that. I really think that's a strength of it. So the bottom line is I think this is one of the most impressive positive studies in pancreas cancer in any of our lifetimes, and that was certainly in our chat groups as well. The survival benefit is large. It's clinically meaningful. You can't unpick it as a statistical artifact because it's real. The toxicity profile is EGFR driven, but one that we're familiar with, and I think the fatigue is favourable. And I think that's really, really good. The key discussion points aren't whether the trial's positive, it clearly is, but rather how representative the patient population is of routine practice and whether it will translate, the same benefits will translate into real-world practice. Whether PFS was necessary, I don't think it is, and how much confidence we have that these results will generalise to less fit patients. Now, I'm hopeful that they will. We know with BRAF inhibitors in BRAF driver mutation melanoma that you can give them to an ECOG PS4 patient and they still work. It's just how long they last for, which is there. So I think this is the major breakthrough of the meeting. It's the major breakthrough in pancreas cancer in our lifetime. Everyone's going to be doing me-too on RAS inhibitor drugs for the foreseeable future, and we're going to be seeing a first-line study in no time. And then the other question, of course, is whether it's going to couple up with chemotherapy.
So there's a first-line study already underway. I think we learned about that when there was the press release. Well, we talked about that in the last episode, so I'm pretty sure when I dug around, there's already a study recruiting.
Yes, someone flicked up a trial sheet of all the different studies, all the different companies which were doing them at the moment, and it was like a 20-agent grid of studies there.
With this particular agent, the daraxonrasib, was it? How do you say it?
Daraxonrasib.
Yep. There's actually, I think the study is chemo plus or minus daraxonrasib, and you can only imagine if that big benefit in second line, you would hope there would be even more impressive benefit in the first line setting, and maybe the study needs to be just this drug versus chemo.
I think that will probably be the next one, right? Fulfirinox versus another gemabraxane versus probably to check out how it works, really, Craig, and then whether or not you couple it with chemo or not. I mean, I suspect that for pancreas cancer, it'd be great not to have to couple it with chemotherapy.
If you think about other disease types where we have both targeted agents and non-targeted agents, the combinations with chemotherapy, if you, by virtue of doing that, then are unable to give decent doses of either, always worry me. So that's number one. I think also, say if we talk about breast cancer or EGFR or RAS-RAF wild type colon cancer, we do our best therapy first and then use our second thing. That's what tends to work better. And so the more targeted, less toxic therapy goes up front, and then you save your chemotherapy till later. I don't know whether that will pan out in pancreatic cancer, but these people look like they may be holding on to performance status. And next episode, we will be talking about cyclic MEK inhibitors, which give me even more hope. So in pancreatic cancer. So I think there's a lot coming.
Great. Chris, there was another thing we wanted to talk about. You have a little sound.
Oh, yeah. I have not been in a meeting with a response like this before.
At the minute, I think there was not one but three standing ovations during the presentation, and the presenter complained that his time was being too by the crowd. You felt quite emotional, and I get that.
Yep.
I've sort of in two minds about the sort of euphoric response, because again, I remain aware and respectful of the patients who went on the control arm and didn't get a crossover.
But does it? So, but that's where my hope comes from, because what was making me emotional was, I could name them, bless them, the young people that I've lost this year, and by young I mean people in their early 30s, who for 6 months good quality time is all they wanted. Yeah. A young man who didn't survive to his own wedding. I know in breast cancer we're talking about 10 years, 15 years of having metastatic disease. We're nowhere near that in pancreatic cancer. Right. So the concept of 6 months of extra time, that's where I'm excited about. I got excited about fulfirinox, for goodness sake. So, so this is just a whole other thing. And as I say, I've got a lot of hope for these cyclic MEK inhibitors. So that's where my emotion came from. And I could picture the people in my head who I would have loved to be able to give this. Now, the sad thing, of course, is we don't know whether this is going to be accessible, both in terms of supply and import and cost. But at least we know the science works, and hopefully we'll get some Me Too generics in about 25 years' time.
No, it's exciting. As Smith mentioned, there's a whole lot of other drug being developed, but it's a small company developing it, so you do worry about the supply and their ability to ramp up production. But yeah, it's an amazing study and it's offering great hope. And of course, there's other cancers that are KRAS predominant. Lung cancer, for example, we see we've got 12C and 12D inhibitors, but they're a minority of the KRAS, which is 30%, I think, of lung cancer. So, hugely common cancer.
Colon,
40%.
Colon.
Yeah.
Exactly. So let's hope that we see these class of drugs have a big impact in space of time.
These are going to be ESMO magnitude clinical benefit 4 or 5 drugs. And clinical trials, by and large, reach about 5% of people. So we can't say that Me Too trials are the method of accessing these because tissue requirements, because screening, because performance status, because comorbidity, because whatever. I mean, they have to be reimbursed, which means that the pricing of them has to be affordable in a single payer system, so funded by a PBS or a Pharmac. And so there is a price point issue that has to happen. But this is where I would say, let's not fund the ESMO MCBS 1 and 2 drugs in order to create the money for drugs like this that actually work.
Right.
Just a very quick shout out in the May New England Journal of Medicine that had the phase 1b/2 paper in.
Yes.
There is a very well written 2-page article by Channing Durr and Jen Ye, which explain the mechanism of these medicines. So to the trainees and non-trainees, science behind the study, editorial, advances in RAS therapeutics with pancreatic cancer, get on it, and then these conversations will make much more sense to you.
Thanks, Kate. And I forgot to mention when I was talking about the PROTEUS study, there was an excellent New England Journal editorial, which goes through the kind of recent history of treating men with high-risk prostate cancer. So again, I would encourage people to have a look at that. It's not a very long one, and it's very well written and puts this study in perspective. So we'll put a link to that as well. So lots to learn. It was a really fantastic ASCO plenary, because often they have like a negative study and it's like, why was this a plenary? It sounded like it was a very exciting meeting. And so we'll talk more next time. We'll do a bit of a cook's tour through, unfortunately not through the Chicago food landscape, which is fantastic, but a cook's tour of various cancers from the ASCO meeting.
My favourite meal this year was at a Chinese hot pot restaurant with Kate. It was really good.
Pre or post karaoke?
Karaoke was an accident, you know.
The best bit about the hot pot restaurant was everybody got their own apron.
Save my white shirt.
Sounds intriguing. Thanks to both of you. It was very informative. Thanks to all our listeners. Thanks to Rachel on the desk there, our producer. And shout out to Graham, who's going to splice all that and try and make sense of the episode. So we will talk to you all again very soon.
That's it for this episode of the Oncology Journal Club podcast, where oncology papers meet real-world practice. If you'd like to explore the papers we discussed today, head to oncologynetwork.com.au and visit the Oncology Journal Club tab, where you'll find show notes, links to the research, and a growing collection of OJC resources. Don't forget to join the Oncology Network. It's free. You can send us voice notes and chat with us on social media. And physicians, you can also claim CME points for listening to this show. This podcast was proudly produced by the Oncology Network. Until next time, thanks for listening.